the beginning of the case and the shocking discovery. 1847. In the chill of early September 1847, the rolling hills of western Massachusetts seemed as tranquil as any postcard view. The forests had begun to turn with the season gold bleeding into red, and the air carried that faint crispness which promised winter. Yet for a small investigative team dispatched from Boston, the beauty of Berkshire County's countryside was only a cruel mask. They had come to a site locals whispered about as Ellington's educational farm, though the property had stood abandoned for nearly a decade. Their mission was to follow up on unsettling confessions made by a woman in Hartford, a woman whose statements hinted at graves hidden under the soil. For several days they scoured the grounds, guided by the testimony of a traveling tinker who knew the land's contours like the back of his weathered hands. On the third day, beneath a cluster of ancient oak trees behind the main farmhouse, the spade of a sheriff's deputy struck wood. The sound rang differently from the thud of dirt. It was a hollow, muffled knock that made every man present glance at the other. They cleared the soil away and uncovered a crude wooden box, its sides softened by rot, its lid barely holding together. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a child, small fragile bones wrapped in fabric. The cloth, miraculously intact, bore the stitched initials S.B. Investigators later matched these letters to the name Sarah Brennan, a red-haired girl whose official records claimed she had been placed with a loving family in Ohio. But Sarah had never left Massachusetts. By the time the excavation ended, 43 small graves had been found scattered across the property, their arrangement haphazard as though each burial had been a hurried necessity rather than a solemn ritual. The victims were all children, most between 6 and 12 years old, none who had lived to see their 14th birthday. The discovery sent shock waves through the investigation team, men hardened by years of criminal inquiries who now stood pale-faced at the enormity of what they had uncovered. In Boston, official placement records painted a story of success children sent westward to build new lives in wholesome farming communities. In reality, those children's lives had ended in the cold, damp soil of this Berkshire hillside. What had masqueraded for nearly 2 decades as an institution of charity, moral instruction, and opportunity was in truth a machine of exploitation and death. What made the case all the more chilling was the secrecy that had cloaked it for so long. Even among historians specializing in 19th-century welfare institutions, the Ellington Farm scandal was virtually unknown in 1847. State officials had buried the original inquiry so deeply that only fragments survived, disconnected ledgers, vague inspection notes, and a handful of letters that hinted at inconsistencies. The facade had been convincing a benevolent farm where city orphans could escape the soot and vice of industrial mill towns. For years, no one with authority had looked too closely, and those who did had been met with plausible explanations and polite deflection. Now, with the graves laid bare, the truth began to seep through the cracks in the official story. This was not a case of unfortunate accidents or the occasional tragedy of rural hardship. This was systematic, planned, concealed, and repeated. 43 children had vanished from the public record, replaced by lies so polished that agencies in Boston and Lowell had once congratulated the Ellingtons for their remarkable success. As autumn deepened in Massachusetts that year, the leaves fell over a crime scene that would force an entire state to confront the dark underbelly of its own institutions. Massachusetts, in 1829, a state in transformation. To understand how such a place could exist undetected for so long, one must step back to the Massachusetts of 1829, a state teetering between the old agrarian rhythms and the thunderous heartbeat of the Industrial Revolution. Cities like Lowell and Lawrence were booming, their textile mills roaring day and night, spewing out fabric to clothe a nation. The prosperity was unprecedented, but it came with a hidden cost. The machinery claimed fathers in sudden brutal accidents. Disease, especially tuberculosis and cholera, claimed mothers in the cramped tenements that housed mill workers. The rush toward urban growth shattered families by the hundreds, leaving behind a tide of orphaned and abandoned children. They wandered the cobbled streets, clustered in alleys, or crowded into overfilled almshouses, where disease spread as quickly as whispers. Into this chaotic landscape stepped Josiah Ellington, a man who knew both the promise and perils of industrial life. At 42, he was tall and gaunt, with a face framed by prematurely white hair and eyes of cold, penetrating gray. His voice carried an even deliberate cadence, the sort that could quiet a church pew or command attention at a town meeting. His wife Constance was no less formidable. At 38, she possessed sharply drawn features and an acumen for numbers that neighbors described as uncommon for a woman. During Josiah's years supervising at the Peton Mill, she'd managed the household finances with precision, developing an instinct for profitable ventures. The couple owned a sprawling 200-acre property in Berkshire County, some 30 miles southeast of Pittsfield. The land had been in Josiah's family since 1782, granted to his grandfather for service in the Continental Army. It was a place of rolling meadows and stands of maple and birch bisected by a stream that powered a small grist mill. To the casual observer, it seemed an ideal location for raising children far from the grime and vice of the city, a pastoral refuge where young lives could be reshaped by clean air and honest work. But to Josiah, the property represented something more, an opportunity to turn the desperate social conditions of the day into a self-sustaining and highly profitable enterprise, the founding of Ellington's educational farm. In the spring of 1829, Josiah began visiting municipal authorities in 3 different mill towns with a proposal that struck them as almost too generous to be true. He offered to take in up to 20 orphaned children at a time, promising food shelter, education, and moral instruction. In return, the children would perform light agricultural work suited to their age and abilities. To sweeten the offer, Josiah requested only a modest subsidy, $12 per child per year, to cover basic necessities. For overburdened towns, it was a godsend. In Lowell alone, there were nearly 300 homeless children crammed into disease-ridden almshouses. Sending some of them to a country farm promised fresh air, open space, and the chance to learn useful trades. State inspectors like Dr. Samuel Harrington praised the idea, describing Josiah as a man of exceptional Christian character, well versed in the practical arts of agriculture. Reports framed the proposal as an enlightened alternative to the harshness of urban institutions. But not everyone was convinced. Reverend Daniel Parker of Lowell's First Congregational Church interviewed Josiah for references and left the meeting unsettled. There was something in the man's talk of discipline that chilled him, an impersonal way of speaking about children as though they were livestock, useful, manageable, and disposable if they failed to meet expectations. Despite such doubts, The crisis in the streets outweighed hesitation. By June of that year, the first group of children city orphans carrying little more than threadbare clothes and a handful of belongings arrived at the Ellington Farm. Among them was an 8-year-old boy named Timothy Caldwell, whose parents had perished in a winter mill fire. Timothy's case file marked him as bright and eager to learn. His caseworker, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, wrote that he should benefit immensely from the rural education and moral guidance Mr. Ellington's establishment provides. No one yet knew that the education awaiting Timothy had nothing to do with books or moral instruction, and everything to do with how much labor a child's body could produce before it broke. The first group of children, and the reality behind the facade. When Timothy Caldwell stepped off the cart that brought him from Boston to the Ellington Farm in June of 1829, the countryside must have looked like an entirely different world. The air smelled of grass instead of coal smoke. The horizon was unbroken by factory chimneys, and the hills rolled gently toward the distant blue line of the Berkshires. For a boy who had grown up in the shadows of mill buildings, the first sight of the property might have seemed like a promise. That promise dissolved almost as soon as the children were led to their quarters. Instead of the sunny, airy dormitories, city officials had been told about the children's sleeping quarters were in the basement of the main farmhouse, a low-ceilinged, stone-walled space that held the damp like a sponge. Even in summer, the walls wept moisture. 22 children were crowded into a room meant for storing root vegetables and tools. They slept on thin, lice-ridden straw mattresses that were rarely changed and never properly cleaned. The only window was so small that even a cat would have struggled to squeeze through. Light, when it came, was pale and grudging. Their day began before dawn. Constance Ellington would descend the basement stairs with a metal pot and a wooden spoon, striking them together until the sound ricocheted off the stone and startled the children into wakefulness. There was no time for washing or any semblance of personal care. 10 minutes after the first clang, every child was expected to be dressed and outside ready for work. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was a thin gruel of cornmeal and water. On rare mornings there might be a scrap of bread, often fringed with mold. Any child who complained about the taste or failed to finish was denied the midday meal entirely. Work began immediately after breakfast and continued until well after sunset. In the height of harvest season, even the youngest 6-year-olds, barely tall enough to reach the top of a bushel basket, were put to work in the fields for up to 16 hours. They picked apples, hauled water, and cleared rocks from the planting beds. Their small hands were perfect for tasks like cleaning the gears of the grist mill, which inevitably led to injuries. Sharp edges and moving mechanisms took their toll. Timothy learned this lesson only 3 weeks after his arrival, when his left hand was caught between 2 grinding stones as he scraped away debris. 2 fingers were crushed, deep cuts running jagged across his palm. The infection set in quickly. By the end of the week, Timothy's hand was swollen and hot to the touch, his fever making him lightheaded. Josiah's response revealed a darker truth about the farm's philosophy. Declaring the boy guilty of malingering, faking his suffering to avoid work, Josiah locked him in a windowless storage shed and gave him only water. Timothy would later be told that he had been taught an important lesson about the consequences of carelessness. In the private journal Josiah kept hidden, an entry appeared that week. Coddling such children only reinforces their natural tendency toward laziness and self-pity. Hard work and discipline will make useful citizens of them if they prove worthy of survival. The message was unmistakable. The Ellington Farm was not a refuge. It was a labor camp where a child's worth was measured in stamina and compliance, and where injury or weakness was a liability that could shorten your life. The first death, Sarah Brennan. Sarah Brennan arrived in August 1829, just 2 months after Timothy sent from Boston, when her widowed mother succumbed to tuberculosis. At 10 years old, Sarah was described as spirited but obedient by her placement worker, with freckles across her nose and a gift for needlework. She carried a small bundle of clothing and a sewing kit, perhaps the only tangible connection to her former life. Sarah's health began to decline almost immediately. The diet of watery gruel and occasional bread offered none of the nourishment she needed, and the endless labor in the fields sapped her strength. Within weeks, her hair began to fall out. Her gums bled, her teeth loosened, and her skin took on the pallor of candle wax. When she faltered in her work, Constance labeled her a drain on resources and reduced her rations even further. Eventually, Sarah was moved into a smaller, darker room in the cellar, away from the other children. Her cries for water or food echo through the stone walls at night. Those who dared to sneak her scraps were punished, locked in the root cellar for days with nothing but dirty water. The other children learned quickly that compassion could be as dangerous as disobedience. On October 15, 1829, Sarah died alone in that basement cell. Her death was never reported to authorities. Instead, Josiah wrote to the Boston Placement Agency, spinning an elaborate story about her successful relocation to a prosperous farming family in Ohio. The letter included charming details about her new bedroom with a view of the pasture and the affectionate new parents who promised to give her an education. It was convincing enough that the agency sent a letter of congratulations to the Ellington Farm praising Josiah for finding Sarah such a promising future. That night, under the flicker of a kerosene lantern, Josiah and Constance carried Sarah's body into the oak grove behind the farmhouse. They dug a shallow grave, placed her inside, and covered the earth until the spot looked undisturbed. Sarah became the first entry in Josiah's hidden death ledger and the first grave in what would become a private cemetery of vanished children. Her disappearance set a precedent. Every death could be explained away with a fabricated adoption, every absence concealed under a veneer of charity. And in that cold October soil, the Ellington Farm's transformation from struggling institution to deliberate killing ground had begun, a pattern of disappearances. As autumn gave way to winter in 1829, the other children began to notice a pattern. Every few months, someone would vanish, first from the work detail, then from the sleeping quarters, and finally from conversation. The Ellingtons explained these absences with practiced ease. The missing child had been blessed with good fortune and placed with a Christian family heading west. The story varied in detail, but never in tone, delivered with the same benevolent smile that made it difficult to challenge. The surviving children quickly learned not to ask questions. Those who did risked being locked in the root cellar for days or deprived of food. The message was reinforced by the absence of any return visits from the adopted children. None ever came back to say goodbye. Timothy Caldwell survived his first winter, but the boy who emerged in the spring was a shadow of the one who had arrived. Once curious and talkative, he now spoke only in short, guarded replies. When his caseworker visited, He avoided eye contact, staring at the floor as Josiah stood beside him, ready to answer on his behalf. The official records described his demeanor as a normal adjustment to the discipline and structure of rural life. In truth, it was the posture of a child who had learned that trust could be fatal. The system that allowed this to continue was carefully constructed. Constance kept 2 sets of records, one for the inspectors listing healthy children and glowing progress notes, and another hidden behind the fireplace in Josiah's study, documenting each death, the cause, and the burial location. Between 1829 and 1832, 27 children died at the farm. Officially, of the 41 children placed during that period, 39 were recorded as successfully adopted. The arithmetic should have been a red flag, but with hundreds of placements across dozens of institutions, overworked city officials rarely cross-checked the numbers. It was in its way a perfect crime for its time. The distances were too great, the records too fragmented, and the trust in a man's good Christian character too ingrained. The Ellingtons had found the gap in the system's armor, and they were exploiting it with ruthless efficiency, shielded by the community's trust. In an age when information traveled no faster than the mail coach, and a man's word could outweigh any written record, Josiah Ellington understood that the greatest safeguard for his operation was not secrecy alone. It was reputation. He cultivated it with meticulous care. In the nearby village of Hillsdale, Josiah was a regular presence at town meetings, speaking passionately about the importance of moral guidance for unfortunate children who might otherwise fall into crime. He made generous donations to the local church, arriving early on Sundays and positioning himself where the congregation could not miss him. He even hosted occasional public days at the farm when local families were invited to tour select areas of the property. On these carefully choreographed occasions, the children presented were dressed in their best patched but clean clothes. Their faces washed, their smiles stiff but convincing under Josiah's watchful gaze. To the casual observer, nothing seemed amiss. The children appeared thinner than one might expect, yes, but the prevailing wisdom of the time considered leanness a sign of health and discipline. If they did not speak freely, it was taken as evidence of good training. The farm's isolation worked in its favor. Few outsiders came without invitation, and those who did were shown only what Josiah wished them to see. The grist mill with its steady hum served as proof of industry. The neatly fenced vegetable garden suggested self-sufficiency. The livestock in the barn, though fewer than one might expect for a property of that size, provided the illusion of a bustling, productive homestead. Local officials were not just deceived, they were invested in the deception. Judge Marcus Fairfield, Justice of the Peace for Berkshire County, later admitted that he had never questioned the Ellington operation. Mr. Ellington appeared to be doing the Lord's work, he testified in 1847. The children I saw seemed well behaved and properly supervised. If their clothing appeared somewhat worn or if they seemed thinner than one might expect, I attributed it to the healthy effects of outdoor work and simple living. In a rural community, appearances were often accepted as reality, and no one wanted to believe that a man who spoke so earnestly about Christian duty could be guilty of cruelty, much less murder. This shield of community trust was perhaps the most insidious element of the Ellington Farm's survival. It ensured that when whispers of mistreatment occasionally reached the ears of those in authority, They were quickly dismissed as misunderstandings or the petty gossip of dissatisfied neighbors. The Ellingtons understood human nature well enough to know that people are reluctant to confront the possibility of evil in those they admire. That reluctance bought them years in which dozens more children would vanish behind the farm's stone wall. The quiet witness, Jacob Fletcher. While the townsfolk and officials saw only what Josiah wanted them to see, there was one man who, without knowing it, began collecting the threads that would one day unravel the entire facade. Jacob Fletcher was a traveling tinker, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a craftsman's patience. His trade took him from farm to farm across western Massachusetts, repairing cookware, sharpening blades, and mending tools. The Ellington property was just one stop on his seasonal circuit, but over time he began to notice things others missed. The children I saw there, Fletcher would later tell investigators, were not like farm children elsewhere. Farm children are usually sturdy and quick to smile, eager to watch a stranger work and ask questions about the world beyond their home. The Ellington children moved like shadows, keeping their eyes down, speaking only when spoken to. Their clothes were little more than rags, and I could see their ribs through the fabric. Fletcher's work brought him to the farm in every season at different hours of the day. In the spring of 1834, he counted at least 18 children laboring in the fields. By autumn, only 11 remained. When he asked Josiah about the missing ones, the answer was always the same: they had been blessed with good fortune and sent with Christian families heading west. The phrase became so familiar to Fletcher that he began to think of it as Josiah's stock answer, a pre-written script for nosy questions. But the most unsettling detail came from an absence rather than a presence. In nearly 6 years of visiting Fletcher, never once saw a child older than 12 or 13. In a normal household or institution, he should have seen the natural progression of children growing into adolescence, taking on more complex tasks, mentoring the younger ones. At the Ellington Farm, the children remained perpetually young, as if they were being replaced before they could grow up. Fletcher stored these observations away in the quiet compartments of his mind, not yet certain what they meant, but sure enough that something was wrong. In the years to come, those fragments of memory would become the map investigators followed to uncover the graves. The drought of 1836 and Timothy's death. By the summer of 1836, nature itself turned against the Ellington operation. The stream that powered the grist mill dwindled to a sluggish trickle, and the once green pastures faded to brittle brown under the relentless sun. Crops failed across the county, and farmers everywhere tightened their belts, hoping to outlast the weather. For the children at the Ellington Farm, there was no such reprieve. The shortage of food became a weapon. With no mill income and dwindling harvests, Josiah faced a choice: reduce the number of mouths to feed or risk exposing his inability to keep the farm running. His solution was brutally efficient. Over the course of 3 months, 7 children died. Each one weakened by years of malnutrition and unable to survive on the meager diet of a handful of corn and the occasional wild berry. Among them was Timothy Caldwell, the boy whose injured hand had marked one of the first recorded punishments in Josiah's hidden journal. By then nearly 12 years old, Timothy had grown taller and stronger than many of the younger children. In a different place, he might have had a chance to survive the drought. But years of deprivation had left his body fragile beneath the surface. The added strain of long days in the parched fields with no shade and little water was more than he could endure. On August 18, 1836, Timothy died in the same basement storage room where Sarah Brennan had spent her final days 7 years earlier. Timothy's death was more dangerous to Josiah than most. His placement had been arranged through a Boston charity organization that required annual progress reports, and Timothy himself had been taught to write simple letters to his caseworker each Christmas. Of course, those letters had been forged by Constance, who had become adept at imitating a child's handwriting. When no Christmas letter arrived in 1836, Timothy's caseworker, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, began to ask questions. Her curiosity would become the first real crack in the Ellingtons' facade. A crack that once widened would expose the horror buried beneath the rolling hills of Berkshire County. The visit of Mrs. Hartwell. By September of 1836, the absence of Timothy Caldwell's customary Christmas letter gnawed at Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell's instincts. In her years as a placement worker, she had learned to recognize the small warning signs that something wasn't right, and this was one of them. The letters she received from Timothy each year had been simple but consistent short lines about the weather, the harvest, the kindness of Mr. and Mrs. Ellington, enough to reassure her that he was alive and in some form of routine. The missing letter was troubling enough, but what truly unsettled her was the tone of the last one she had received the previous year. It was too formal, too mature in its gratitude, as if written by an adult, trying to imagine a child's voice. She couldn't prove anything, but she couldn't let it go either. On September 23rd, 1836, Mrs. Hartwell hired a carriage and made the difficult trip west to the Ellington property without sending prior notice. She arrived in the late afternoon, the wheels of her hired buggy crunching over the dry, cracked earth of the farm's approach. In the kitchen, Constance Ellington was preparing the evening meal, a thin broth made from potato peelings and scraps of fat, when she caught sight of the stranger in city clothes stepping down from the carriage. Her face tightened. She sent a boy, Peter Hoffman, 7 years old and new to the farm, to fetch Josiah from the fields immediately. The boy sprinted between rows of withered corn, knowing full well that delays in carrying out Constance's orders meant punishment. When Josiah arrived, the woman in the parlor wasted no time. "I would like to see Timothy Caldwell," she said, her tone brooking no argument. Josiah's mind spun. Timothy had been dead for more than a month. "I'm afraid that's impossible, ma'am," he replied smoothly. Young Timothy departed for Kansas Territory just last week with the Thornton family. They were most eager to arrive before the winter set in. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes narrowed. "That's curious, Mr. Ellington. Your letter mentioned a Methodist family. Are the Thorntons Methodist?" The question caught him off guard. He stammered briefly before regaining his composure. "Why, yes, of course, most devout Methodists. I misspoke when I failed to mention their name." But she was no longer listening to his excuses. Through the parlor window she could see the children in the garden, thin, slow-moving, their clothes hanging loose on their frames. Over the next 3 hours, Mrs. Hartwell conducted an unannounced inspection. She toured the children's sleeping quarters, dark, damp, and far too cramped for the number of occupants. She interviewed several of the children, their responses either hushed to the point of inaudibility or carefully guarded. One little girl burst into tears when Timothy's name was mentioned, whispering only, "He got sick and then he went away." "We're not supposed to talk about the ones who go away." When Mrs. Hartwell left that evening, she carried with her not just suspicions, but the first concrete observations that would form the basis of a formal report. Her notes described the conditions in detail: overcrowded sleeping quarters, malnutrition, untreated illness, and a pervasive fear among the children. It was the beginning of the end for the Ellington operation, though it would take more than a decade for the truth to fully emerge. The plan: to shut down and silence the witnesses. The Hartwell visit rattled the Ellingtons. For the first time in nearly 7 years, someone with official authority had seen past the carefully maintained facade. Josiah knew that the inspection report would eventually make its way to Boston, where its contents could trigger an investigation. The problem wasn't just the report, it was the 11 children who still lived on the property. They had witnessed the disappearances, the punishments, the graves dug at night. If they were transferred to another institution, they might talk. Josiah's solution was both calculated and monstrous. He began spreading a story throughout the local community the Ellington Farm would be closing. The couple, he said, was planning to move their entire operation to Missouri, where the land was cheaper, the climate milder, and agricultural work possible year-round. He spoke warmly about the opportunities awaiting them in the West, how grateful they were for the support of the Hillsdale community, and how the remaining children would accompany them to begin a new life. The narrative served multiple purposes. It explained the farm's closure, justified the disappearance of the children, and discouraged any expectation of follow-up visits. In reality, the Ellingtons had no intention of relocating. Between December 1836 and March 1837, the 11 remaining children died one by one. The timing of each death was deliberate, often coinciding with severe winter storms when visitors were unlikely to make the journey to the isolated property. Josiah's journal entries from this period are chilling in their detachment. December 18th. The Hoffman boy's cough disturbs the others. Isolated him in the root cellar. The cold should expedite matters. January 4th. Mary Sullivan's curiosity about Timothy makes her unsuitable for relocation. Reduced rations accordingly. By February 22nd, only 3 children remained. The final entry, dated March 15, 1837, was a single sentence. The Lord's work is complete. Tomorrow, we begin our new life. When spring came, the Ellington Farm stood silent. The house that had once echoed with the forced labor of dozens of children was now empty, save for Josiah and Constance. In the oak grove behind the farmhouse, 38 graves lay under freshly leveled earth, indistinguishable from the surrounding grass to all but the most observant eyes. Disappearance and growing suspicion. The official narrative that the Ellingtons had relocated to Missouri should have ended the matter, but it was too specific, too public to vanish without trace. Jacob Fletcher, the tinker, whose quiet observations had been accumulating for years, noticed almost immediately that something didn't add up. He began asking wagon masters and shipping agents whether they had transported a family matching the Ellingtons' description west. The answer was always the same. No such booking had been made, no wagons hired, no freight arranged. Fletcher's curiosity drew him back to the abandoned farm in the summer of 1837. He found the place eerily still, the fields overgrown, the mill wheels stilled. But as he walked the property, his craftsman's eye noticed irregularities in the ground, rectangular patches where the grass grew differently, as if the soil beneath had been disturbed and replanted. They looked to him like graves. Meanwhile, in Boston, Mrs. Hartwell's report had set off quiet inquiries into the financial records of the Ellington Farm. The deeper investigators dug, the stranger the numbers became. Over an 18-year period, the Ellingtons had claimed subsidies for nearly 200 children, while reporting that the vast majority had been successfully placed with adoptive families. Not a single one of those families could be located. The narrative of benevolence was starting to crack. It would take another decade, the death of Josiah and the unraveling mental state of Constance, before the full truth came to light. But from 1837 onward, the Ellington name began to carry a faint shadow, a shadow that, when finally illuminated, would reveal one of the darkest scandals in Massachusetts history: Constance's collapse and confession. By 1847, a full decade had passed since the Ellington Farm had been abandoned. Josiah had died in 1843 of pneumonia, his death unremarked outside a small notice in a Hartford newspaper. Constance Ellington, now in her late 50s, was living under an assumed name in a boarding house in Hartford, Connecticut. She had aged rapidly in the years since leaving Massachusetts. Her once sharp features had softened into something gaunt and ghost-like. Her hair streaked with white, her posture bent. More alarming than her physical decline was her mind's steady unraveling. Boarding house residents described her as a solitary figure, keeping to her room except on Sundays, when she attended multiple church services in a single day. At each congregation she would sit rigidly through the sermon, only to approach the minister afterward with rambling confessions that drifted between prayer and accusation. She spoke of children, little souls who never had the chance to grow, and of graves that cried out for justice. Her words unsettled those who heard them, but in a city where eccentricities were common, most dismissed her as a lonely, pious widow. It was her landlord, Mrs. Catherine Morrison, who first suspected there might be more behind the ravings. Concerned by Constance's increasingly erratic behavior, muttering to herself at night, pacing the hallways, weeping in the early hours, Mrs. Morrison confided her worries to local ministers. One of them, Reverend Thomas Hayes of the Second Congregational Church, began to speak with Constance more deliberately. He noted that while her stories wandered certain details, repeated with unnerving precision the number 43 references to the farm in the hills and the name Sarah Brennan. In March of 1847, after an especially impassioned sermon about repentance, Constance gripped Reverend Hayes' arm so tightly he thought she might bruise it. She whispered, 43 little souls, Reverend. 43 children who never got to grow up because we were too proud to admit we had failed them. That moment shifted Hayes's perception entirely. This was not the vague religious guilt of a troubled woman, this was confession. He documented her statements, and after several more conversations, contacted the Massachusetts authorities. What followed was the reopening of a case that most officials had forgotten, if they had ever known of it at all. Constance's words, combined with the long-standing suspicions of Jacob Fletcher and Mrs. Hartwell, formed a web of leads that investigators could no longer ignore. Within months, a multi-agency team was heading west to Berkshire County to see whether the whispers of graves were more than the fevered talk of a broken woman, the excavation and the damning evidence. The investigation team that arrived at the former Ellington property in September 1847 was a mixture of state charity officials, Berkshire County sheriffs, and medical examiners from Boston. The farm's once orderly fields had long since surrendered to weeds. The grist mill wheel lay rotting beside its dry stream. and the farmhouse sagged with years of neglect. Guided by Jacob Fletcher, whose memory of the property's strange patches of earth had never faded, they began probing the ground in areas where the grass grew unevenly. The first grave was uncovered in the oak grove behind the farmhouse. Inside a small wooden box, half collapsed from years underground, lay the remains of a child no more than 10 years old. Wrapped around the bones was a strip of fabric embroidered with the initials S.B. Sarah Brennan. Over the next 3 weeks, 43 graves were unearthed, each containing the remains of a child between the ages of 6 and 13. Many showed signs of chronic malnutrition. Others bore evidence of untreated injuries, broken bones that had healed poorly, infections that had gone unchecked. The most damning discovery came not from the earth, but from within the farmhouse itself. Behind a false wall in the basement, investigators found a hidden compartment containing Josiah's private journal and a separate ledger. The journal was a meticulous record of each child's arrival, work performance, illnesses, and most chillingly, the date and cause of death. The ledger went further, revealing calculations on what Josiah considered the optimal mortality rate for the operation, roughly 20% per year, to avoid suspicion, but never exceeding 30%, which could draw unwanted attention. Notes indicated deliberate ration reductions and exposure to harsh conditions for unproductive units, a term he used in place of the children's names. The paper trail destroyed any remaining illusion that the Ellingtons' crimes had been accidental or born solely of neglect. This was a deliberate, profit-driven system of exploitation and murder. Even Constance's later claim that the first deaths had been accidental could not survive the cold arithmetic of Josiah's own handwriting. The farm had not merely failed in its duty, it had been designed to consume children until they ceased to be profitable, and then to dispose of them quietly in the soil. The trial of Constance Ellington. With Josiah dead, the weight of justice fell entirely on Constance. Arrested in Hartford in late 1847, she was brought back to Massachusetts under heavy guard. The trial, beginning in the spring of 1848, quickly became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in the country. For 6 weeks, the court heard testimony from surviving witnesses, Jacob Fletcher, Mrs. Hartwell, and even several local officials who admitted with visible shame that they had never looked closely enough. The prosecution's case was built on 3 pillars: Constance's own confessions to Reverend Hayes, the physical evidence from the excavation, and Josiah's journals and ledgers. The defense argued that Constance had been dominated by her husband, a passive participant coerced into compliance. They presented her deteriorating mental health as evidence of remorse and diminished capacity. But the prosecution countered with entries from Josiah's records in which Constance was not a bystander but an active planner, recommending ration cuts, isolating problem children, and overseeing the burial of the dead. Medical examiners testified about the condition of the remains, painting a vivid, horrifying picture of the slow violence inflicted on the children, bones thinned by malnutrition, teeth lost to scurvy infections that would have been survivable with basic care. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict guilty on 37 counts of murder, along with multiple charges of fraud and conspiracy. Constance was spared the gallows in part because of her failing health and sentenced to life in the Massachusetts State Prison for Women. She would survive 12 years behind its walls, dying of tuberculosis in 1860. Prison records describe her final years as a blur of religious fervor and delusion. Guards often found her speaking softly to the air as if addressing unseen children begging forgiveness for transgressions she would not name. The trial marked a turning point in American legal history. It was among the first to focus specifically on crimes against children within institutional care, and it shattered the prevailing belief that charitable institutions were inherently benevolent. The name Ellington would forever be linked with the darkest possibilities of unchecked power cloaked in the language of moral duty, reform, and the ripple effect. The verdict against Constance Ellington did not close the book on the scandal. It opened an entirely new chapter in Massachusetts history. In the months following the trial, public outrage surged beyond anything the Board of State Charities had anticipated. The notion that a privately operated charitable institution could hide systematic abuse and mass murder in plain sight shook the state to its core. Newspapers from Boston to New York carried lurid headlines about the farm of 43 graves, and editorials demanded sweeping changes to the way vulnerable children were cared for. Almost immediately, the Commonwealth moved to address the legislative blind spots that had allowed the Ellington Farm to operate unchecked for nearly 2 decades. A bill was introduced in 1849 mandating annual inspections of all private institutions receiving state funds for child welfare. These inspections were to be unannounced and comprehensive, with inspectors given unrestricted access to dormitories, kitchens, medical facilities, and work sites. Just as important, the law required that any death of a child in institutional care be reported within 24 hours to both local authorities and the Board of State Charities. Failure to do so would carry criminal penalties. Financial oversight was also overhauled. No longer could institutions submit progress reports without independent verification. Each subsidy claim would have to be matched against the actual physical presence of the child, confirmed by inspectors and cross-checked with placement records. These reforms might seem obvious by modern standards, but in the mid-19th century, they represented a seismic shift in how the state viewed its role in protecting children. Dr. Samuel Harrington, the same official who had once praised Josiah Ellington as a man of exceptional Christian character, became one of the most vocal advocates for reform. In his 1851 report to the Massachusetts legislature, he admitted his own failure to scrutinize the Ellington operation and warned against the dangers of assuming that good intentions or the appearance of them were enough. The Ellington case, he wrote, has taught us that charity without accountability is a house built on sand. We must create systems that assume the possibility of deception and guard against it with diligence. The impact of the Ellington reforms extended beyond Massachusetts. Other New England states, alarmed by the parallels to their own private orphanages and industrial schools, began adopting similar inspection protocols. By the late 1850s, an interstate network of welfare oversight agencies had formed, exchanging information about suspicious institutions and coordinating investigations across state lines. The scandal also sparked a shift in public perception. Where once private, religiously affiliated institutions had been seen as inherently virtuous, there was now a growing recognition that virtue had to be proven, not presumed. The phrase Ellington Standard entered the vocabulary of reformers, shorthand for the rigorous inspections and accountability measures that became the new baseline for child welfare. And yet, even with these changes, the memory of what had happened in the hills of Berkshire County lingered like a shadow, one that reformers would invoke for decades whenever complacency threatened to take root. The long shadow, an enduring legacy. As the years passed, the Ellington Farm itself faded from the landscape. In 1852, the dilapidated farmhouse was demolished, the grist mill dismantled for scrap, and the surrounding fields allowed to return to forest. Nature reclaimed the site, but not the oak grove behind the house. There, the Commonwealth established a small memorial cemetery, each of the 43 graves marked with a headstone bearing a name, an age, and the date of death where known. For those whose identities had been erased entirely, the stones bore only the inscription, "Unknown Child." The central monument carried a stark epitaph in memory of 43 children who came seeking hope and found only suffering. May their sacrifice ensure such horrors never occur again. The site became a place of pilgrimage for reformers, historians, and ordinary citizens alike. Visitors often spoke of an unshakable heaviness in the air, as if the ground itself remembered. Local folklore claimed that birds rarely nested in the grove's trees, and that on certain autumn nights, the wind carried the faint sound of children's voices. The release of the sealed investigation records in 1947, exactly a century after the graves were found, brought renewed scholarly attention. Historians and criminologists examined the Ellington case as an early example of what would later be called organizational deviance, the gradual drift of an institution away from its stated mission until harmful behavior becomes normalized. The case became a standard study in courses on criminal justice, social work, and ethics, illustrating how isolation, inadequate oversight, and financial pressure could corrupt even those who began with legitimate intentions. The legacy also lived on through the people who had played key roles in uncovering the truth. Jacob Fletcher, the tinker whose quiet observations had guided investigators to the burial sites, spent his remaining years traveling and speaking to community groups about the importance of trusting one's instincts when something felt wrong. Evil rarely comes wearing its own name, he would say. It comes dressed in virtue, speaking the language of charity. Mrs. Hartwell became one of the foremost child welfare advocates in the state, helping to draft the very legislation that arose from her investigation. Her later writings were blunt in their assessment. The children who died at that farm were failed not just by the Ellingtons, but by every official who chose to believe a comfortable lie over an uncomfortable truth. Over time, the Ellington scandal shaped more than just laws. It altered the cultural understanding of responsibility. It taught that vulnerable populations, especially children, cannot be protected by good intentions alone. They require systems designed to anticipate failure, prevent abuse, and demand proof of care. In that sense, the 43 graves on the Berkshire hillside were more than memorials to lives lost. They were warning markers visible across generations, reminding all who saw them that trust must always be tempered by vigilance. Shadows beyond the farm. Though the oak grove was quiet in the decades following the trial, the Ellington case never truly left the public mind. Stories persisted, told in kitchens and taverns and on front porches, of travelers who strayed too close to the grove and heard the sound of small footsteps in the leaves or faint knocking from beneath the soil. Rational minds dismissed these as tricks of the wind or the imagination, yet even the most practical farmers gave the place a wide berth after dark. Local children dared each other to run between the headstones, but most stopped short, claiming the air was too heavy, as though it pressed against their lungs. The legend took root in part because the official narrative, one of reformed justice served and lessons learned, did not erase the unease that the Ellingtons had cultivated. For many, the most unsettling truth was not the murders themselves, but the ease with which they had been hidden. Here was proof that evil could wear a face that smiled in church pews, that hosted neighbors at the harvest table, and that spoke fluently of virtue while counting coins earned from the suffering of children. It forced a reckoning with an uncomfortable question: if it could happen here in this quiet valley of Massachusetts, how many other such places might there have been, their graves undiscovered, their records lost? Historians who studied the case in the 20th century began to uncover troubling hints that the Ellington Farm was not an isolated phenomenon. While no other institution in New England matched its scale of cruelty, several smaller operations showed eerily similar patterns. High child turnover, unverifiable adoption claims, and inconsistent financial records. Though none were proven to conceal mass graves, the parallels suggested that the Ellingtons had exploited a weakness in the system that others might have found as well. The fear that this was only the largest scandal, not the only one, lingered like a shadow that refused to disperse. The burden of memory. By the early 1900s, the Ellington Memorial had become part of local identity. School teachers would take their pupils there in the autumn when the leaves burned red and gold to lay flowers on the small headstones and speak of the reforms the tragedy had inspired. For some children, it was their first encounter with the idea that the adults entrusted with care could betray it so completely. The memorial served as both history lesson and moral warning. Not everyone welcomed these pilgrimages. Some locals resented the lingering association between their county and what had become known nationally as the Farm of 43 Graves. Yet there was also a stubborn pride in having faced the truth, however ugly, and in preserving the place so that it could never be forgotten. Families who had lived in the area for generations saw the grove as a debt owed to the dead, a promise that their names would not vanish again into falsified ledgers and forged letters. As time passed, descendants of those involved, investigators, witnesses, even some distant Ellington relatives, occasionally visited the site. Some came quietly, leaving without speaking to anyone. Others sought out local historians, eager to contribute family records or letters to the growing archive. The Massachusetts Historical Society eventually compiled these materials into a permanent exhibit, pairing them with the original court transcripts and the artifacts recovered from the farm. Visitors who viewed Josiah's ledger often lingered in silence, confronted by the cold calculation of mortality rates, written in an elegant hand. It was a stark reminder that monstrous acts can be planned with the same meticulous care as any legitimate business. The echo that remains. Today, the grove stands much as it did when the graves were first uncovered, a ring of oaks sheltering a small plot of white headstones. The air is still the sounds muffled, as though the place exists a step removed from the living world. The names etched into stone are all that remain of children who once ran barefoot in city streets, who dreamed of a better life and who were promised safety only to find the cold indifference of a system that failed them. The Ellington case endures not merely as a chapter in criminal history, but as a touchstone for the ongoing struggle to protect the vulnerable. It reminds us that vigilance must be constant, that trust must be earned, and that accountability must be built into every institution claiming to serve the common good. It warns us that evil rarely arrives as a monstrous figure in the doorway. It comes dressed as help, offering an open hand. When the wind threads through the grove and the shadows lengthen at dusk, it is said you can still feel the presence of the lost. Whether or not you believe in such things, standing among those 43 headstones has a way of making you listen harder, as though something or someone might be speaking just beyond the edge of hearing. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the Ellington Farm, not only the reforms it inspired, but the quiet, enduring echo of voices we cannot afford to forget.